So if all of you can open your Rhino, um, and I hope that this is going to work with the resolution of the projector. So this is the basic interface that you will see. And so I will just spend a couple of minutes going over the different parts of this interface and what are they used for. So, I mean, first of all, you can see that our modeling area here is made up of 4 viewports, which the default ones are called top, front, right, and perspective. But each of these, of course, can be changed to a different number of views. So let's say I want to change my perspective view, and if I click on this little arrow, then in the drop down menu I can both change the way geometry is displayed, and since we have nothing here yet, that's a bit hard to see, so I'll get back to that. But if you scroll down a bit further, then under set view you can see that there are these predefined options, plan, top, bottom, left, right, front, back, which are all kind of, they are orthographic projections, so you are looking at your object straight on from one of 6 directions. And then also there are perspective, 2-point perspective, and isometric views. And so we'll get more into these later, but just so you know that, if for some reason you want to change a view, or the view you have is not what you want, that's how you can change it. And so let me just quickly draw something so you can actually see how this works. So so you can see that my selected geometry is visible in each of these viewports, and so you can use various ways to navigate these viewports. So in obviously in an orthographic projection view, the 2 things you really want to be doing is panning and zooming in and out, since you don't want to change the angle that this kind of imaginary camera is showing your object. So to zoom in and out, I guess depending on what you're using. So I think all of these operations can be done both on a trackpad using different keys on your keyboard, as well as a mouse. So I guess the simplest sense, zoom in and out, you can use your mouse wheel in each of the viewports, and then to pan you hold shift and your right mouse button. And then in the perspective view, if you just simply hold your right mouse button, you can rotate your view in 3 dimensions. And so another thing that you can see shown in each of these viewports is this coordinate grid, which you can see there's a red and a green axis, which is basically XY axis, and there is obviously a third one, the Z axis, which is for vertical information that's not shown. And so and again, I will go back to this, but when you are creating geometry in Rhino, you are basically constructing it in relation to a coordinate system. And so basically the point at the intersection of this green and red line is 0, 0, 0. That's the origin point in the 3D model. And it's a good practice to at least be mindful of where that point is in your model, but really, for the most part, begin modeling at that point, or near that point, so that when you export your geometry into another file, let's say you are exporting into an Illustrator file, your geometry will actually sit in the middle of the page and not somewhere like off even the artboard. And I'm sure that you will come up against this issue at some point. And so learning how to avoid it in the beginning is gonna save you a lot of time, because it's really frustrating when you open an Illustrator file, export it from Rhino, and you cannot even select your geometry because it's somewhere far away, you can't even see it. But so basically, being mindful of where is your origin point and which is the point that everything is referenced to is important to keep your file organized. And also when you import things from other programs too, then this also becomes important. I'm just going to jump to Rhino for Windows, and is anyone actually using Rhino, or sorry, Rhino for Mac? Is anyone using Rhino for Mac here right now? So all of you guys are on Windows. Oh, you are Mac. So, and anyways, for those of you who have a Mac, I think this is useful to know. I'm just going to open a new file here. And besides the fact that my screen is a bit constrained with this resolution, you can see that more or less my interface looks the same, and that's not the case when you open Rhino for Mac for the first time. So I just want to show you how to set the interface for the Windows theme. So basically, under the Rhino menu, you go into Preferences, and then you click on Themes. And so in this top drop-down menu, you can choose between Rhino for Mac and Rhino for Windows. And so I think if you are changing it, you have to either restart Rhino or just open a new Windows. And so that should bring you to this interface. And let's see. Oh, there. Okay, so while this is doing this, I'm just going to talk about some things that are general enough that it doesn't make a difference which Rhino I'm showing it. So so what I started saying is, if I just similarly draw a simple polyline here, is that it's sitting on what is my top view construction plane. So because I drew this line in the top view, it's if I look at it from the front, it's planar, and basically each of its vertical coordinates is 0. And then if I draw something in my front view, then and select it, you can see that if I look at it from the top, it's again one of the coordinates, this time the y coordinate of all the points is 0 because it's sitting on my front view construction plane. And so, when I talk about the origin point in the 3D modeling interface and construction planes, geometry is always referenced to something. And I do not want to get into construction planes too much. And there is, of course, a way to change them to infect whatever plane in your interface. I would say that that's not really necessary for our intents and purposes. And so unless you know what you are doing or sort of go over how to use construction planes, just be careful with them and don't really mess around with them, because you can totally get lost in your model if you don't know what you're drawing is, what the reference is for that geometry. Okay.
Is there one plane that you typically work in to do all your drawing?
So it depends.
Or sorry, view.
So it depends what you are doing. Basically, for the most part, well, I mean, if you are just drafting in 2D and you just want your plan drawing to be planar, then you can just work in the top view, and as long as you have the proper drafting guides turned on, then your geometry is going to stay in that planar space. And so in that case, I would, and you can switch between these views by double clicking the name. So in that case, I would just stay in my top view and give it the full screen so I can see the geometry more. In case you are doing 3D modeling and want to actually start drawing by referencing to points in your existing geometry, which again will become more clear once we start doing things and have some 3D objects, then it's probably good to have all 4 views or be switching between them. So it's really, if you're not familiar with this kind of workflow, and if you have used SketchUp before, for me, that's one kind of annoying thing, having proficiency in Rhino, that I'm used to having these 4 views and the ability to both more objectively in plan and elevation see my geometry and then move around it in perspective, while in SketchUp that you have to change your view and it's kind of you are mostly in perspective view. And so I think that's a big advantage of Rhino, and so I would really if you're not comfortable with it, just keep practicing. So that covers the 4 views that we see, and of course we'll get back to those because that's where you're creating geometry. But I want to talk about these other things, and yeah, I'm pretty frustrated about how blurry the projection is, or my screen resolution. But basically, as you can see, so first of all, you have the kind of conventional set of menus, file, edit, view, curve, which are common to many programs, and then the ones more specific to Rhino, such as curve, surface, solid, mesh, and then things like dimension, transform, tools, analyze, render, and then below that you have what's called the command line, and I guess that should be something that you are familiar with from either AutoCAD or Vectorworks. How many of you know either AutoCAD or Vectorworks in this room? So is that pretty much everyone? So similarly to these programs, one of the, I think, primary ways to input tasks in Rhino is using the command line. So previously I clicked on this icon for polyline, but I can either type line or I can type polyline and click enter, and then my tool for that is active. And beyond being able to initiate commands, the command line is, so even if you're clicking through the menus, so I could go to curve and click on line, and then there are beginning to be many options how to even draw a simple line. Or if you're clicking on the icons, it's still very important to keep an eye on what's happening in the command line. So so if I just hit polyline, you can see that if I didn't know anything about Rhino, it's telling me what to do. It's saying start of polyline, so asking me to click somewhere, and that's going to be the start of my line. And then in the bracket, it offers an option that relates to whether that line is persistently closed, and I'm not really interested in that option, so I'm not going to change that. But as you will see, many commands, and especially more advanced commands, will have many options listed in the command line in a bracket. And so you can see that the P in this option is underlined, and so if I press P, then it actually changes the no to yes. And so before you actually start drawing geometry or executing a command, you can, and by pressing P again and pressing Enter, I can change it back to no. So I can modify the different options of my command. So I really emphasize that you get used to paying attention to that, because first of all, it will help you if you, let's say, forgot how to execute different steps that a more complex command requires. Then just following the instructions is the simplest thing you can do. Or if you want to change the different options, then that's where you would do it. Yeah, so that's the command line. And so some basic keyboard keys basically for starting and ending commands that are very handy would be, so if I start this command but I no longer want to execute it, I just press escape and then it's gone. Or if I want to, I change my mind and I want the same command I was using before or that I activated before, then I can just press space and it's going to bring up polyline again. So instead of typing polyline or clicking in through the menu, I can just press space, and that's a very handy way to, when you're, for instance, drafting and you just want to draw all your lines, you just press space and draw a line, and then press space again and draw another line. Of course, more purposefully than what I'm doing right now. And then if I'm actually drawing this line and press escape, then even though I drew several points, it's going to disappear. So just to bring your attention to the fact that escape wouldn't just cancel, let's say, the last point you are drawing, but the entire command. So be careful with that, especially if you've traced a beautiful curve of some object and you want to get rid of one point. That's not really the most efficient way to go. And so to finish off a command would once again be by pressing space or by pressing enter. Both of them work the same way. And in fact, actually pressing enter when you don't have a command active also brings up the previous command. So enter and space are kind of interchangeable. Yes?
Is there an option other than escape?
There might be, not that I know of. I mean, escape is just, I think, the simplest. Yeah. Really? Huh. Okay, so I mean that question.
I just want to know how to undo the last point.
Okay, so undo would be so either you can go and if you don't know a shortcut, then if you mouse over anything in the icon tool palettes, or if you click on the menus, it's going to show you the shortcut. So for undo and redo, Rhino uses the same general commands like other programs. So Control Z and Control Y in Windows, and Command Z and Command Y on a Mac. No, it would just undo the last geometry. Yeah. And okay, so I'm not sure why escape doesn't work for you, but that and I realize I'm jumping a little bit around because there are many things to know about the interface, but one really important aspect of the interface is to know where you can change different options. And so on Rhino for Windows, that's under Tools, and then the Options command on the bottom of the menu brings up this detailed menu. And again, it's a bit hard to read, but basically you can change from the appearance of your interface to what comes up in your context menu, down to your toolbars, how big they are and so on. And let's just see if I can change this to large. Yeah, I have to. I think there might be an issue with both Windows running on my Mac and the projector, so I'm going to see if I can make that better for next class. But basically, this would be a place to go when something is not doesn't seem to be set up the right way in your interface. And I just want to bring your attention to something that I think, as early, as the earliest, the better it is if you go to click on under Rhino options, click on files, then there is and this should be, I think, checked for everyone. I don't know what the default time is, but first of all, I would have create a backup file when saving. I should have that checked, and also for autosave, depending on how complex your model is. If you have a bigger model that takes a little bit to save, then maybe you don't want it to kind of freeze your computer every 2 minutes. But I would put autosave to a reasonably small unit of time, so you don't lose your work by having something crash your computer, and also just being aware of what location Rhino is saving your autosave file is just gonna ensure you a peace of mind. So again, I'm not gonna go into these settings too much right now, but definitely know how to access this. And I think so I showed how to get it from the menu, but if you type options into the command bar, they come up again. So basically everything, you can do everything in Rhino just using the command bar. Basically, I encourage each of you to explore the interface, and whatever works best for you to kind of figure out how you like to use the interface. There is no correct way. So as I said, the command bar is really handy, but one of my classmates who have also now graduated, and he used to be teaching Grasshopper, it was kind of a relief to see that, or hear him say that for some modeling tools, he actually just goes with his mouse and clicks on the different icons, which might not be the fastest, but works for him. So just be aware of how you can reach the different tools. So to just keep explaining that, you can see that under the command bar we have this set of tabs, which I think if you just start Rhino, it's going to be in your standard tab, but there are a number of ones that you might want to be switching to while you're modeling. And so under these tabs there are a number of icons, and once again, each of them, if you mouse over, it displays what that icon is responsible for. So from opening a file to saving and so on, the standard tab contains many important ones that relate to selection. At the same time, there's a separate tab for selecting geometry, and you can be very specific about what kind of objects you want to select. So there's a command just for selecting points, for selecting lines, selecting surfaces, which, if you just want to grab those in your model and maybe move them to a different layer, that's really handy. So again, it's just kind of going through these is pretty handy, and just understanding how basically in the three different ways, the top menus, the tabs, and then the icons on the left, how different functionalities are organized slightly differently. Yes. And so, yeah, so you can see as I'm switching between these tabs, sometimes the tool palette on the left also changes based on what tab I am in. And then the other really important part of the interface is this set of tabs on the right. And so here you can see, well, really the two that you should always be using and paying attention to is layers and properties. And so again, if you're familiar with AutoCAD, Vectorworks, and program like Illustrator or Photoshop, then I assume that you know the importance of layers and organizing your file into layers. So once you start drafting, you want to put your different kinds of lines on different layers, and when you start modeling, you want to be creating your 3D geometry and placing it on different layers. And I mean, there's no like ideal number of layers. I don't want to say the more you have, the better, but I almost could say that because the more layers you have, the more control you have over different parts of your model. And in the worst case, when it comes to line weighting, you might just merge some of those layers. But having the option to have them separately is really handy. And so so in the layers panel, you can create new layers and also delete them, freeze them, lock them, turn them on and off, and so on. Basically the same functionalities as AutoCAD. So I hope it's pretty straightforward. And also you can create layers within layers. So you can kind of treat layers as folders. So let's say I rename this first layer as curves, and then I can drag these couple of layers and place them in my curves layer, and then rename this layer as, let's say, solids. And so maybe I'm not actually putting anything on my curves layer, but it's going to just serve as a folder containing all my different curves, and then I can turn all of them on and off at the same time. So yeah, just developing, again, there's no standard way to organize layers, but developing a good workflow that's maybe consistent between the different programs you use is a good idea. And then, so besides the layers panel, the other really important one is the one that's called properties. And so right now I don't have anything selected, and so you can see that it's just this. If I don't have anything selected, all it's showing is the information about the viewport that's active. So if I click between the different viewports, the information slightly changes. So just to go back to viewports, you can see, for instance, that the top viewport is it says that it's a parallel projection, and also actually describes how big my viewport is, which I can individually adjust each of these viewports if I want to kind of customize how big they are. And so once I click on an object, the properties panel becomes really important because it describes what this object actually is. So so this polyline that I drew, it's actually in terms of a type of object, it's described as an open curve, and what that means is that it's a polyline that has two endpoints and it's not closed. And so if I click and draw another polyline that now is going to be closed, then here it's described as a closed curve. And so this will become really important when you want to create 3D geometry from 2D geometry. Sometimes you just want to extrude or use an open curve to create a surface or a simple extrusion. But very often you want to be working with closed curves, and so to make sure that the geometry is actually what you think, it's very good to constantly check that indeed this is a closed curve. And you know, I could have, if I wasn't, maybe I didn't have the right precision aids turned on, which is the next thing I want to go through, then I could have drawn this polyline. Let's say I draw another one. You know, if I'm just kind of eyeballing things, and so you see that it's snapping to a point right now, but for some reason I click like that and like zoomed out far away, I think it's closed. I mean, this is not a good enough example, but I'm sure you will encounter an example where for some reason you clicked wrong and you zoom in sort of infinitely and will realize 2 points don't overlap, and that's the reason why your geometry isn't behaving the way you want it to be. So so the properties panel, both for curves and then for surfaces and polysurfaces, is really important to check. Yes?
For that, would you just suggest redrawing, or is there a command to support that?
Yeah. There is. In fact, there are multiple ways you can deal with it. So as we will begin to go through all the tools, I can show that. Yeah. So that's a good question. That's sort of practical, but also conceptual. For the modeling process, at what point when you discover a mistake in your model, at what point do you fix things, or at what point do you go back to your base geometry and recreate your geometry? And so once again, I'll mention this when we are actually beginning to model in 3D, but I recommend that you keep your layers well organized and you keep the traces of your process in your file intact. And so one thing I haven't shown is also in the standard viewport. There's this gray light bulb icon, which if you click on it longer, then it brings up a bunch of different options about hiding and showing objects. So you know, one way to manage content is either to put it on a layer that you turn off, or if on one layer you have too much stuff going on and you just want to see more clearly, then you can click on that or just simply type hide, and then it's disappeared. And the nice thing about it is that it also releases strain from your video card, so Rhino doesn't need to be displaying it in every view that you have, especially when it comes to complex model that can speed up your process, because your computer isn't dragged down. So and if I want to show that again, I just go show. Yes, and then okay, so before talking about these things on the bottom, I just want to show, and this again should be repetition, but basically in terms of using your mouse to select objects, Rhino works the same way as I think AutoCAD and I assume Vectorworks as well. So if you want to select objects using a so-called bounding box, so you just draw a box with your mouse, then if you mouse over things from left to right, then and release your mouse button, then only things that are fully within the bounding box get selected. So you can see this larger line, even though I sort of touch on it, it doesn't get selected. If you do that from right to left, then everything is selected. And then besides that, if you actually want to be selecting objects individually, then the way you do it is you hold Shift and just click on each object. And if you want to subtract something from your selection, then oops, and this is where I'm gonna get confused with the PC Mac thing. I think you hold, yes, you hold Control on a PC and maybe Command on a Mac, and so that individually deselects objects. And you can use these, you know, in a combined way. So let's say I mouse over these things and then I want to select that guy too, so I use Shift and so on. And of course things become more complicated when you are in a 3D perspective view and you have many objects to select from, and you perhaps accidentally select something far away in your 3D model. So for that too, I think it's very useful to pay attention to multiple things actually. So let's say I do this bounding box and select objects, then you can see in the properties panel that 3 curves are selected. So I mean, of course we don't always know how many things we are actually want to select or have selected, but just you know, if it would say that, like if I drew just a solid here and let's say just make a quick surface here. So if I select all these objects, then you can see that for the type it says it varies. And so if I only wanted to select curve, that should make me suspicious that something is going on. And then once again, if you go into the select tab, and I'm mainly going to show commands because that's perhaps more difficult to sort of find or know. So if I just start typing select, actually, you know, this infinite list of things come up. So you have to get used to some of the abbreviations that Rhino uses. So if I only want to select curves, then I can scroll down to cell curve, and so all the curves are selected in my model, but neither this surface nor this solid object gets selected. And actually, just to show how these are different, let me change my view here. So instead of wireframe, which only shows the kind of exterior geometry of an object, I'm going to display a ghosted view. So you can see as I rotate the model, this is a surface. So it's not just a rectangle that's defining that's just a curve, but it's an actual surface here. And on the contrary, this is a solid, so it's a fully closed cylinder.
Sorry, can you show how you did the ghosted view?
Yeah, so you just, in whichever view, so it doesn't need to be perspective, I can do this in my top view too. I just hold this little drop down arrow, and so you can choose between these different views. And you know, in terms of which ones are useful, I would say for sure shaded is useful because it's actually just showing what things are solid and what things are curves. So if I switch my perspective to shaded, then you can see that unlike the ghosted view, I cannot see inside a cylinder, but maybe I don't want to. On the other hand, if you want to understand your model, maybe it's more complex, has many three-dimensional objects side by side, then you want to probably be using either the ghosted or the X-ray view, and these are just basically showing the interior to a different extent, showing transparency to a different extent. If you want to show or maybe display your object in a, well, I wouldn't say realistic, but in a way that shows light and shadow, then you would go for the rendered view. And then there are things like artistic, where it looks like, you know, watercolor paper is the background. And if you like drafting like that, go for it. So it's just a matter of preference or pen. Yeah. Yeah, and so going back to the last part of the interface, which is really important, is basically these bottom two rows. And so right now you can see that I just opened this new file and nothing is checked. And so what these boxes are the short term for them is OSNAPs, which stands for object snaps. So these are really essential for, any kind of command that you're undertaking to be able to control what geometry you're referencing and snapping to and so on. So again, this should be familiar from 2D drafting applications. Some of the names are a little bit different. So basically, end stands for an endpoint of a line, and so if I turn that on and start a line, then when I snap to this endpoint, it's going to, Rhino is going to tell me that I'm snapping to an endpoint. And so there is simply point, there is midpoint, and so if you mouse over them, you will see the details. Yes?
How do we get those boxes to display?
Oh, if you don't have them displayed, then you should type OSNAP. And is that actually, hold on, that's actually just bringing up these menus in the command bar. Let's see. Oh yeah, you have to type show OSNAP, I think. And so so now my command bar says OSNAP window is visible, and so I can give a new value. So if I type age, then it's gone. And so if I type show OSNAP again and type S, then it's shown. So once again, all these things can be controlled with the command bar, and yeah, it's really important to make sure it's not just gone and gone for good, because you really won't be able to follow along and do the things we are doing in class if you don't have these. So you can see that I skipped over near. That's the second one. I can show you what it does. So I check near, and again, just click on a polyline. It's anywhere I click on a line, it just says near, which, let's say I really just want a line that is touching that other line, and then near is useful, but it's not very precise because I have no idea where I just started that. And so really I could say almost as a golden rule that just don't use near unless you really just want to end the line at another line. But I would even say don't bother turning near on, just extend it further and trim it off, because if you turn near on and forget it on, then you can really start messing things up, because your lines might be snapping to points you don't want. And so there is center, intersection, perpendicular, tangent, and so on. So you can sort of play around with these, especially the last ones aren't necessarily so obvious. Yes?
How can you bring up those options in the bottom?
These ones, these boxes. So it's the command for that is show OSNAP. So you just type show OSNAP. And if you press enter, then in the command line you can toggle whether it's on or off. Got it?
Yes, you go to tools and then objects.
Yeah, so there is always multiple ways to get at that. Okay, and then the other thing is that that's below these object snaps is a couple of other snaps, and not I think it might be again a resolution issue, why these are sort of collapsed on my screen, but I'm just going to read them. So the first one is grid snap, which basically, if I zoom in here a little bit, you can see that I have this grid that's made up of a certain unit, and I realize I actually haven't talked about units, so that's going to be the next thing. But so my file, I think it's probably set up as millimeters, but we'll check that in a second. So this grid is these grid lines are at every certain unit, and that's something you can also change. And so what grid snap would do is, if I start drawing a line here, it's a bit hard to see it on the screen, but if you do it yourself, you can see that as I move my line around, it actually wants to snap to the intersection points of this grid. So let's say that you are working with an actual grid-based geometry in plan of something you are designing, then changing the grid to whatever unit you are using can be handy, and then you know that you're just snapping to these points. In general, I don't really use grid snap because there are other ways. I mean, basically, when we are drawing lines, we can input the length of a line or create guides and so on to measure, keep track of the measurement of our geometry. So again, there might be a time when that's useful. Something that you, for the most part, should have turned on is the second tab here that's called Ortho, which again, similarly to 2D drafting software, is forcing your geometry to happen on the XY axis. So again, I'm drawing this. I drew this polyline, but this time with my ortho on, and so now it's perpendicular, and all the line segments are in the XY. And so if you are, let's say, tracing a conventional house plan in Rhino and then you want to extrude it later, then it's good to have ortho on. And if you have ortho on and you don't want to be turning it on and off all the time, if you just want to temporarily disable ortho, then I thought that if you press shift that turns it off, but somehow that's not happening right now. Can you guys try? I wonder if that's again an issue with my parallels here.
I know you can temporarily turn it on, so if you have ortho on.
I think it should work both ways. Yeah.
If you hold down shift, it seems to work for turning it on.
Down shift.
I have it on and I'm turning it off. If I hold down the shift.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought. I'm not. Yeah, okay, now it's. Oh. Yeah, exactly. I think I just. What else have here? Yeah, that's. I was really confident that you hold down shift and then it's off. But I'm sort of thrown off today with what my Windows is doing to me. So I will just get back to you about that next class. And then, the next one that's called planar basically forces your geometry to be planar when you're drawing. And that's also something useful to have on, so that, and again, this is gonna become clear when you do this, but if you are in perspective view, and I'm just gonna switch this um, to wireframe again. So let's say I want to draw a curve, and I'm gonna turn all of these things off. So if I'm just in perspective and drawing a curve like this, then, well, let's see what I did. But and let me just zoom to it. So you can see that it's totally out of control what I'm doing. Except that, yeah, and this is something important to note. And again, I hope that by doing it, you will understand that, as I mentioned, the top, front, and right viewports, they have their construction planes which are perpendicular to your view. So the top one, the construction plane is flat. I mean, all of them are flat, but it's sort of the XY axis. In the front view, it's the Y and Z axis. And in the perspective view, your construction plane is the same as the top view. So you can see that I drew this curve in perspective, and it looks, I mean, you would think it's sort of standing up, but it's actually like projected flat onto my plane. And how I can check that is that in the front view it looks like a single planar line. And so what the planar snap does is to ensure that let's say I have a 3D model and I'm drawing a curve, and I could be snapping to many different points in the 3D model, and I'll show an example of that once we are modeling in 3D. And so the planar snap would not allow me to just draw a totally three-dimensional curve. And I'm realizing that we are quickly running out of time here, but one more thing that's really important to know about modeling aids is Smart Track, which basically, let me get back to these lines. And all of the things I'm explaining or briefly explain today about the interface, I will go over once again when next class we are gonna actually look at all the 2D drafting tools. So Smart Track allows you, I think, again, similarly to all these other programs, to reference other geometries. So not only be able to snap to different points. So I'll first of all turn my OSnap back on and have maybe ortho on. Is, let's say I want to draw a line from this point, and I want it to finish where that endpoint is at the same level. So you can see, because I have Smart Track turned on, it's projecting, and depending on where I click, it's projecting these different lines, horizontal and vertical, and sometimes, you know, angular lines. And so that would allow me to let's say create a straight line there like that. Yeah, I generally recommend that you have Smart Track on as well, unless you want to create a freeform curve where you are tracing something and you don't want anything to tell you what you want to do. Yeah, so I think that basically we have covered all these elements of the interface. What I would say again is I would recommend spending some time, and I didn't mention, but in the syllabus I indicated, I mean, this is not exactly precise because there are many things to go over in class, and sometimes if I see an opportunity for some tool, then I might go over it. But basically, the interface is introduced in the Rhino training manual, chapter number 2, and so I didn't actually get to go over these tutorial files that are in the Dropbox. But if you wanna play around, then you can basically, these two files are beginning to introduce through this. They were set up by Thomas, who I mentioned. He was also involved in kind of creating this course. They are set up in a way where there is an example of a different type of command, and then there is space for you to basically repeat that command. And so I'm definitely gonna go over most of these next class, but if you want to kind of play around, I find it easier to learn something if you have something to do as opposed to just clicking randomly. Then you can look at that.